This is the podcast Inside Brains with expert interviews from neuroscience, psychotherapy and coaching. My name is Matthias Wittfurt. I'm a neuroscientist myself and I like to ask questions. And the questions I asked my guest in this episode are concerning political choices of voters. My today's guest from this episode is Libby Jenke. She is a doctoral candidate of political science in the Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. She has published a very interesting paper in the journal Trends of Cognitive Sciences that's entitled Issues or Identity, Cognitive Foundations of Voters' Choice. And this interview, of course, is of particular interest because we talked on the day of the election of Donald Trump in the United States. So it has been quite a while since we met on the phone. What are the reasons people choose to vote for? And is there something like political neuroscience and brain research regarding this field, or is it still in its infancy? And I think it's a little bit odd that we don't ask these questions more often, especially because we are heading forward to the German election on Sunday. Are voters' choices based on rational insights or are they irrational? These are the questions I asked Libby Jenke, and I hope you enjoy it. And now, without further ado, please listen to this interview and just enjoy. Welcome to Inside Brains. What is the story behind your article? So how did you started to collaborate with Scott Huettel?
So I am a sixth-year PhD in the political science department here at Duke. And about 3 years ago, I joined Scott Huettel's lab. And the reason that I did so was that in political science, I'm in an area of study called behavior, where we look at individual behavior of voters. And basically, we use surveys as our data a lot of the time, but surveys can't tell us everything that we would like to know. So, for example, if you think of a partisan identification, so a party ID, we call it, you can think of people who are extraordinarily well-reasoned regarding why they are of the party ID that they are. So these are people who know a lot about politics and who have reasoned from policy to a party ID. And then there are other people. So you can imagine someone who grows up in a household that is of a certain partisan identification. And maybe that person will take on the same party ID as their parents have. And this person might come to embrace some of the policies of that party, but it really wasn't the reason that they became a member of that party. And these people, so if you gave the two of them a survey question asking them, what policies they support, their answers might be the same, but the reason that they are their party ID is very different. And we would expect that if the party were to change its policies on something, you would see very different effects with the two people. So that's an example of a question that a survey we can't get at that question using surveys. And so the hope is that we'll be able to use FMRI data as an alternative data source. So that's the hope. I joined his lab about 3 years ago. And then we were just working in this area, and we're certainly motivated by recent elections to focus on identity.
Yes, okay. So, and your article is a kind of presenting a new idea, a new theory about voters' choices. But you mentioned FMRI. So have you already underwent FMRI studies, or did you already do some MRI studies regarding this topic?
So no, we haven't,
Okay.
and we're planning to do so right now. We're running mTurk studies to see if we can, manipulate whether people are using policy or identity, to see what the proper measurement of identity is, and these are the precursor studies to doing an FMRI study, which we should get to in the next year.
Okay. You in this article, let's talk about your Trends in Cognitive Neuroscience article. You state that the most common models assume that voting is a rational choice, right?
Yeah.
And what is your additional proposal to this? So why isn't this sufficient so far?
Yeah. So what we mean by rational choice models, and we go through, I think, 3 of them in the article, is that they tend to focus on issues or policies as the main variable that determines a person's vote choice. And to the extent that these rational choice models consider identities, they tend to be party identification or race or gender. And they're always done in an additive sense. So that is, you just add the variables in and run your model. But our idea was that policies and identities actually will compete. So it's close to a dual process model, although not precisely a dual process model. So our idea is that people tend to use mainly one or the other in deciding who they're going to vote for.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So my idea was, when I read your article, what about emotional choices or non-rational choices that are frequently happening in other areas of life? So isn't it, is political science or neuroscience not that far that you can include these kind of choices, or is what do you think? What are your opinion about this?
So I think emotion is a big topic, and it's not necessarily the case that someone won't be highly emotional over a policy. Yeah. So can you explain a little bit more what you mean by emotional?
I've done a lot of emotional research, brain research, and I've started with cognitive neuroscience and cognitive conflict decisions. So when you have information that interferes with your actual task at hand. And during the years, I realized that many emotional or bodily influences putting the choices in a specific direction. So sometimes they're necessary to decide what to do. It's a kind of gut feeling or a bodily feeling what is right to do. So is the inclusion of body feelings, is it a topic for you, or is it not discussed in political neuroscience at the moment?
So there are a grand total of probably 3 or 4 political scientists who do neuroscience work, and actually 2 of those people are doing biology work. Basically, they're looking at genes. And the third person, I know has working papers, but I don't think has published any. So there are maybe 5 papers that have been published. That look at any neuroscience at all. And so I don't think any have looked at that. I know that studies have looked at differences in brain regions that are used between Democrats and Republicans, but I don't think anybody has looked at emotion. And identity and emotion are certainly related, but it's not what we're focusing on right now. But I agree that it's a great topic. Certainly there's a lot of neuroscience work on it, and a lot of political science work too. So I think that that's an area where future work can certainly look.
So actually, there are not many people working in this field and political neuroscience. What do you think? What is the reason that this is not so much investigated until now?
Yeah. Well, so I typically look at neuroeconomics as sort of the model to follow, because that's a pretty well-established field. And I think a main difference between the two is that economists have a lot of very simple games that they use to test out their theories. So there's the ultimatum game, for example. And it's relatively easy to put a person in the fMRI machine and have them play these games.
Yes.
But political scientists, on the other hand, one of the main things that we look at is vote choice, and it's very difficult to have somebody vote in an fMRI machine. Essentially, you can't do that, and so I think that's part of the reason why it has not grown to be a big part of political science yet.
But you're convinced that this is a very important research field.
I would say I am exploring this research field.
Okay.
So, a lot of the papers that have been written about neuroscience and political science are, they largely come down on one side or the other. So neuroscience is going to save political science, or it's going to wreck political science. And there are a few that are in between, but most of these are not written by political scientists who have spent much time in neuroscience departments or labs. And so I decided that actually getting some experience with neuroscience was a good way to see whether it had anything to offer.
Okay.
And so for example, the first project that I worked on in the lab was on resting states and the default mode network, which has nothing to do with political science at all. But it was just getting me familiar with analyzing fMRI data, using FSL. And so, I guess I'm trying to look at it from a neuroscientist perspective and from a political scientist perspective.
Okay. My question sounded a little bit too critical. That was my intention. When I was asking if you think that this is an important field, I was more referring to the fact that maybe there are a lot of interest groups, political interest groups, that are very keen to know what ways there are to influence the voters' choices.
Oh yeah. Yes, there are. I honestly, I'm thinking mostly in terms of political science theory, and I suppose that could eventually be used by campaigns, but that's not the way I tend to think of it.
Okay, yeah. Do you have any experience that political people trying to gain from your research or try to influence some topics from your department?
No, I don't actually.
Okay.
So this is the first of my papers that has gotten any press at all. And Huettel and I had a couple people want to talk to us, but just news sources.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, today is a huge day in the United States, election day. So it's more than coincidence. Somehow it's I don't know that we're talking about this and having this conversation. Maybe this is a silly question. Based on your model, have you make some predictions about the election?
No, our model is not. First of all, it should apply to any election, and we don't have any predictions to this election.
Okay. What are your ideas about the voter participation? So how does the ideas or the identity of the voters relate to the amount of voters' participation? What's the reason why people don't go to the elections?
Well, actually, so rational choice models of political participation say that it is irrational to vote at all. Mm-hmm. So that is, voting involves costs, and the chance that the election will turn out to be a tie or be determined by one person, which could be your vote, is so infinitesimally small that it's really not worthwhile to go out and vote. And so actually our model offers an explanation as to why people might vote at all. Okay. And so this references a previous theory in political science called expressive voting, and we just sort of provide a more specific motivator of expressive voting, and that is that the idea that you're not thinking about the likely policy changes that would be made under one candidate or the other, but instead you're thinking about how your vote makes you feel as a part of a group.
Okay, yeah. Let's try to make an example of your model when we take a look at the actual or of the presidential election today. So, what are your thoughts about people voting for Hillary or for Donald Trump? Despite the fact that there are some media campaigns about Trump's issues related to women or Hillary's email affair, what do you think about this?
Well, I think one of the clearest examples in this election that we've seen of identity, and it applies to both parties actually, is the strong preference for anti-establishment candidates. So I think we saw this, for example, with Bernie Sanders. So a poll came out in late January showing that for one of the most important policies in the election, which is the economy, Bernie Sanders supporters were more likely than Hillary Clinton supporters to say that economic inequality was a big problem. But Clinton supporters were more likely than Sanders supporters to support many of the steps that Sanders proposed to take to combat this. So, for example, raising the minimum wage. And so, given that a large portion of his followers did not seem to actually agree with him on the policy issues, an alternative explanation for why he was so popular is just that he was an anti-establishment candidate. So he ran for senator in Vermont as an independent and didn't actually join the Democratic Party until he ran for president. And so I think he's a good example of the way that identity has worked in this election. And the same goes for Trump. He is an anti-establishment and non-Washington political elite. And I think people have really liked that so far.
Okay. What is your impression of the atmosphere in the U.S. at the moment regarding or concerning the election? Overall, general, what was your feeling today?
Well, I am...
Maybe it's too general, the question, but...
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just going to say I'm at a university, so I tend to be surrounded by a bunch of liberals,
yes.
So they are scared.
Yeah. Okay.
But generally, I mean, the two candidates are two of the least liked presidential candidates that the U.S. has ever had. And so I think that people are very tentative as to what's going to happen if either of them wins. So will there be more more news on Hillary Clinton's emails, even if she wins, and what will be the results of that. So I suppose very tentative would be the overall mood.
Yeah. Do you think there is a kind of potential danger if Trump loses, because he was very cagey in accepting the results?
I mean, it's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose it's just going to depend on how people interpreted his comments as to whether they decide to do something about them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
What could you try to make, from your background as a political scientist, make predictions about the future, how the development would happen in the future if Hillary wins or if Donald Trump wins?
Ooh, can you focus on that question a little bit more? In what area?
Yeah. Do you think there's let me phrase it in another way.
Okay.
What are the biggest issues in the future that will be faced if one or the other wins? So what would be the main issues in the people's minds? So it would it be security? Would it be economy? What do you think?
Well, I am unsure as to what will happen if Trump is president. Mm-hmm. So he came into this election season without very many clear policies, and on some policies he had been on the Democratic side of things in the past, and so I think it's really hard to tell what will happen if he becomes president. Yeah. I think for either candidate, the Supreme Court nominations are going to be a big issue. Okay. Just because they're going to be on there for so long. So, yeah, I think that's going to be the first one, basically. They're going to decide whether or not to accept President Obama's nominee. And then within the next 4 years, they'll probably likely have the opportunity to nominate more people.
Mm-hmm. Is your impression that the liberals you're surrounded with in the university are especially afraid of the final results, and maybe it's not comparable to other elections before? Is it what you feel right now, or is there no difference? Because these candidates are so unliked, yes. Both of them.
Yeah, I would say that it is different from previous elections. Like I said before, both of the candidates are strongly disliked by the overall public. And so, yeah, I think that they're much more nervous this election than they have been.
Yeah. Let me, if I may, just ask something about your neuroimaging studies that you're planning in the future. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this? What your plans when you measure people?
Sure. So right now we are mostly working on MTurk. Do you know Amazon Mechanical Turk? Do you know of that survey?
No.
Okay, so Amazon has a sort of survey software called Amazon Mechanical Turk, mm-hmm. and basically anybody can sign up and take the surveys. So it's not nationally representative, but it's a good way to get data really cheap and really quickly. So we've been running several studies over the past couple of weeks on there to figure out, how do we actually measure identity? So there's some work in political science on identity, but those theories tend to not connect the idea of identity to any general framework for voter decision making. Mm-hmm. And so we're actually not sure of how to get a good general measure of identity. Okay. And so we've been working on that. We've been working on testing whether it appears that policy and identity actually do work at odds, and not in an additive manner. And we have some results showing that they do so far, but like I said, this is not a nationally representative sample. Yeah. And so our work for the last couple of weeks really just has been to try to flesh out some of the questions that we are asking people, to see if we can try to manipulate whether people are using identity or policy. And we haven't really gotten to the details of our FMRI study yet, simply because we're not sure how to ask, how to measure identity at all yet. Okay. So hopefully we'll be there soon. But we were just trying before the election to collect as much data as we could.
So you have added some complexity based on your model, and now you have to deal with it, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. What was your way into political science? So why did you choose? What was your reason? The reason you choose to study this, or what have you studied actually? Psychology or?
Yeah, I studied political science as an undergrad. Okay. And the reason I did was that it seemed important.
Yeah.
And that was really it. And it actually turned out to be a much more interesting field than originally I thought it was. And so I decided to go to graduate school in it as well. But the undergraduate political science, I had no idea how many methods are used in political science. That ranges from history to computer science, and neuroscience even. And so I think it's a fascinating field. But I didn't know that when I started off in it.
Okay. Do you have a kind of history of political engagement? Or
no, I don't actually.
Okay.
I just like to study it.
Yeah. Okay. What kind of books have influenced you? Maybe political books or other books. What would you recommend for listeners?
So there's a great book that two very prominent political scientists, Aiken and Bartels are their last names. And it is a book called Democracy for Realists. And it was just released this year, and it's about why rational choice models of political choice are incorrect, and what that means for democratic theory generally. Okay. And so I would recommend that one.
What is your opinion about Edward Snowden? So what did you what did you hear from other colleagues maybe? What is the general opinion about this issue?
It's not something that I've talked about with a lot of people, and it's sort of beyond my field of study. So I don't have a hard opinion on that.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the interview. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.